Shenanigans. Good morning. It's Wednesday, June the 17th, and this is The Drill. Thank you very much. I'm Ron, your host and the only true conservative in the United States today. I created this podcast to answer the question most asked by conservatives, namely, what can I do? My podcast is short, approximately 5 to 10 minutes long, because shorter podcasts are easier to download and listen to. I've been listening to conservative talk radio since '89. I've grown up in a socialist household, and I've learned the tricks of socialism. My podcast is made available through Spreaker and can be heard on iTunes, Spotify, Google, and YouTube. Today, what can I do? Quote of the day, a critique from a listener, and time to call shenanigans. All that when I come back. Thank you. What can I do? Criticize, criticize, criticize. Criticize especially fellow conservatives and those that call themselves moderate. Being conservative must mean something. It must be defined. If it means different things to different people, it simply ceases to exist. Remember that the cafeteria is closed for good. You cannot pick and choose. There are no social conservatives or fiscal conservatives, just true conservatives. Remember also that the incontinent, the vicious, those prone to vice, and the bestial cannot be conservative. Atheists cannot be conservative. Only monotheism is consistent with conservatism. Idealism is out. Realism is in. If someone claims to be conservative but does not act or think like it, you must criticize them. You must criticize them for it. Next up, the quote of the day. Thank you. The quote of the day comes from Don Schwager. Quote, Lord Jesus, give me a lively faith, a firm hope, a fervent charity, and a great love for you. Take from me all lukewarmness in meditating on your word, and dullness in prayer. Give me fervor and delight in thinking of you and your grace. Fill my heart with compassion for others, especially those in need, that I may respond with generosity. Unquote. Up next, a listener critique. Thank you. I received a critique from a YouTube subscriber who shall remain anonymous for the time being. Quote, you barely touched on the problems with unions in my podcast called Police Unions Have Got to Go. Make another video, but next time light their sorry asses up. The unions are scum who keep scummy employees at work. Unions are a problem and have been a problem in every field they infect. This video hardly addressed the problems with unions. Let's get honest and call the sorry union bastards out. Unquote. This critique was outstanding. It was candid, direct, clear, and conservative. And it was conservative not as much because of the content, but by the way that this subscriber communicated. And let me see, it was... Oh, yes, I was going to say, I will indeed create new content regarding unions, particularly public employee unions, and I will do so shortly. Next up, it's time to call shenanigans. Thank you. And it is time to call Shenanigans, which is an article written by Robert Wright for the American Institute for Economic Research. Quote, for those unfamiliar with South Park Season 2, Episode 13, to call shenanigans is to publicly accuse someone of rigging a game. In the South Park case, a carny rigged a game so that no players could win unless he wanted them to. In our case, the government rigged the response to COVID-19 until La Folla Grande, I guess FOIA is the Freedom of Information Act. It will remain unclear exactly who did the rigging or why, but the how is now crystal clear. Faulty logic. Somehow the fact that scientists did not know everything about the virus became that they did not know anything about it. They even called it the novel coronavirus, as if it came from outer space or arose sui generis, although it is just the most recent iteration of a whole family of viruses that could have been studied for decades. They could and should have known that a vaccine is unnecessary, that infected people develop immunity or die, and that it spreads mostly through droplets spewed forth by people with respiratory symptoms. That faulty sense of uncertainty was used to take extreme and untried measures to slow the virus's spread under what is called the precautionary principle, or the notion that it is better to be safe than sorry, which was taken to mean that the governments had to do something. But if scientists truly knew nothing about SARS-CoV-2, then they should have advocated doing nothing until it was well enough understood to proffer effective policies, lest they inadvertently contribute to its spread. Yet, for some stupid or evil reason, policymakers privileged the precautionary principle over the core of the Hippocratic Oath, which is to, quote, do no harm, unquote. That precept also militates against taking extreme policy measures certain to cause significant harm to public health, as the economic lockdowns implemented in most countries and most U.S. states were bound to do, especially if maintained for an extended period. A surgeon who amputated a leg because it might get infected by a pathogen that might quickly spread throughout the patient's body would have her medical license revoked immediately. The policymakers who followed that same illogic should suffer the same fate. In the aforementioned episode of South Park, Officer Barbrady makes clear that calling shenanigans is not a behavior to be undertaken lightly. Although an outspoken critic of governmental responses to COVID-19 panic, I have thus far refrained from directly impugning our policymakers, who it seemed had merely made poor decisions in difficult circumstances. I can no longer do so because the only conclusion consistent with available evidence is that most of America's policymakers are either lying about COVID-19 or they are irrational. In either case, they need to be removed from office at the earliest opportunity using any and all lawful means. Those protesting George Floyd's death have essentially called shenanigans on major police departments nationwide and earnestly seek change. In the process, they have brought many of us to the same conclusion. Our law enforcement leaders are either liars or stupid. The most stunning revelation is that chokeholds are acceptable police tactics in many cities. What was a tagline for that one? Quote, when your authority as a police officer, experience at de-escalation, baton, taser, handcuffs, backup officers, and Glock 9 are not enough, go ahead and choke a bitch. COVID-19 presents a much more nuanced example of a state overreach because it is an unseen foe and surprisingly undetectable. That is because it is more a scientific construct than a thing. It is a bit of RNA, ribonucleic acid, which is kind of sort of similar to DNA, that evolved by means of natural selection from another bit of RNA. It was always genetically heterogeneous and has continued to evolve. A new strain, probably less virulent than the one from Wuhan, China, may have already evolved in Italy, That would not be surprising because less virulent variants are more likely to spread than deadlier ones, as deceased hosts don't cough, sneeze, or otherwise spray viruses around. The species boundaries of extant sexually reproducing organisms are subject to a real-world test. If a male and female can produce offspring that can also successfully reproduce, then the parents are from the same species. If they cannot produce any live offspring, they are from different species. And if their mating produces a live but infertile offspring, they are members of different species that are in the process of speciation, of becoming genetically isolated groups, in other words. There's no similar objective test for viruses, which induced host cells to replicate them. So scientists cannot reject the hypothesis that there existed a COVID-18, 17, 16, and so forth, perhaps all the way back to a COVID 10,000 BCE, introduced by precursors of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that human immune systems fought off without vaccines, hydroxychloroquine, or ventilators. Surely, some individuals succumb to these earlier COVIDs and are buried in the catch-all respiratory ailment in the cause of death statistics. Millions of others, though, were infected and survived, many without any symptoms at all because they had already been infected by earlier versions and thereby developed some antibody immunity to similar coronaviruses. We can never know the details of the earlier coronavirus pandemics because nobody bothered to develop any tests. There was no need because scientists understood that scientists understood that viruses do not wipe out host species. They co-evolve with them. As The Atlantic pointed out in 2016, a truly scary contagious disease has two main attributes. Quote, first, it would have to be so unfamiliar that no existing therapy or vaccine can be applied to it. Second, it would have to have a high and surreptitious transmittability before symptoms occur. Public health officials and mainstream media touted both of those notions for months, but turned out to be not just incorrect, but knowably so, right from the start of the pandemic. What is truly novel about SARS-CoV-2 is that governments decided to try to make it legible, in the sense that James C. Scott uses the term in his classic Seeing Like a State, how certain schemes to improve the human condition have failed. In the process of trying to control the virus, the governments reified a process, turning an ever-evolving chunk of RNA into a thing so that its experts could count the infected and trace the virus's spread. Recall that the government insisted on developing its own tests for the presence of the virus. That is because to control the test for a virus or anything really is to control its defining attributes. This bit of RNA is SARS-CoV-2, that one is not. This behavior is police brutality, that one is not. This child is autistic, that one is not. But the real world is messy, and the coronavirus is not homogeneous. So testing for it turns out to be a sticky wicket indeed. Both active tests for the virus and serological tests for the antibodies provide many false negative and false positive readings. Perhaps 20% false negatives in the active tests for a variety of reasons, including because they compare a sample to a single static referent. Coronaviruses can kill you, as so many other things can, but the chances of it doing so are not very high, especially if you are not old or sickly. Two economists, yes, economists skilled in modeling and statistics, more skilled than your average epidemiologist, it appears, have recently shown that the infection fatality rate of that bit of RNA reified as the SARS-CoV-2 virus must be much lower than most previous estimates. Their paper, which has been peer-reviewed and is due to be published by the Journal of Econometrics, explains why. It is sophisticated stuff that I'm not even going to begin to try to explain, because the point is that policymakers should have figured this out before using the coercive power of the state. And make no mistake, the threat of revoking the occupational and business licenses of people who tried to reopen their failing businesses in a last-ditch attempt to save them is just as coercive as a chokehold, though less physically violent. to shutter businesses in 45 states and the District of Columbia by unconstitutional fiat. Note especially that the econometricians obtained their results solely by critiquing the rational parameters of the denominator, the number of people infected, and took the numerator, the number of deaths from COVID-19, as given. We know, however, that not all deaths attributed to COVID-19 were caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. There might be some undercounting too, but the death tolls related in the media are far from ironclad facts, as it is too difficult to parse those who died with COVID-19 from those who died of it. Some suggest that we get around that problem by tracking excess deaths, deaths greater than expected, but that conflates deaths from COVID-19 with deaths caused by the economic lockdowns. Suicide spiked, and non-COVID patients were turned away from treatment or refused to enter COVID-19 cesspools. Most vexing of all, shelter-in-place orders reduce the effectiveness of our immune systems, rendering people more vulnerable to all sorts of contagious diseases. But surely merely the invidious way that the virus spreads via surfaces and asymptomatic people created uncertainty enough to err on the side of caution and lock everyone up, right? 1 out of 2 isn't bad. Well, it turns out that the World Health Organization has finally come clean. The novel coronavirus, like many viruses before it, does not spread readily via contact or asymptomatic people. How people who do not appear sick and hence who are not coughing or sneezing or drooling all over others were spreading the virus has troubled me over the last few weeks. Yes, people spit when they talk, but the virus resides primarily in the lungs and deep in the upper nasopharynx, which is why those hellaciously long swabs are necessary to test for it, even inaccurately at that. In short, not only could COVID-19 have been kicked in the can without lockdowns, a fact proven by 5 free states, policymakers should have known that the notion that the virus was surreptitiously spreading through casual contact was bogus. It spread mostly on subway trains, hospitals, and nursing homes by people who were symptomatic. The optimal policy, therefore, would have been to warn against big indoor events and to create PSAs about hand washing and social distancing, incentives for people showing any respiratory symptoms to self-isolate until cleared through testing or loss of symptoms, and lazarettos for those suffering from enough COVID-19 to seek medical attention. As the most effective care was merely palliative and did not require ventilators or highly trained medical experts to assist, there was no need to flatten the curve and raise the line, as there was no chance of hospitals being overrun and people dying needlessly, which ironically occurred due to the lockdowns. So again, it's not that policymakers were proven wrong in the face of a difficult situation. It is that they had the information necessary to respond rationally to the threat posed by a slightly evolved bit of RNA, and yet did not do so for reasons still to be determined. Shenanigans. And it's by Robert E. Wright. And I will be back in a minute. Who is a true conservative? He is the person that has the courage of his convictions and is confident in what he knows. He's the person that understands that cultural conservatism is more important than political conservatism. He's not selfish, but minds his own business. He acts like an adult. He's patriotic and uses common sense. He expresses what he knows and does so with certainty. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why, rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, influential, and not ashamed of his existence. Unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American, and he is better than the socialist. He's a better friend, father, brother, family member, and a better person, period. You have to know that. If you do not know with every fiber of your being that being a true conservative is best, then you're wasting your time. And that brings me to the end of another episode of The Drill. Remember, be honest, be smart, and be beautiful. And always ask yourself, what is real? How do I know? What do I do about it? I'm Ron, and that's the drill.